So the NFL draft is here, and it used to really be a huge, big deal to college football because you could turn the results of the NFL draft into a recruiting advantage. And in a sport where you're looking for every recruiting advantage that you can get, that's a big deal. For instance, the cornerback out of Toledo is probably going to be a first-round pick, probably the top half of the first-round pick tonight. And don't be surprised if Toledo turns Quinyon Mitchell's draft slot into a really big deal to future recruits, and justifiably so. Now, obviously, with some blue blood programs that you're going to get a little different spin on that. Like, hey, we've had like 12 of those dudes in the last 5 years or whatever. But it always used to be a really, really, really big deal. And I think it still is a really big deal, especially to a group of five school, or if you get, you get a Joe Flacco or somebody like that that's an FCS player, Trey Lance, that gets drafted in the top 10 or the first round or the first two rounds, you can turn that into a big recruiting pitch. But we've talked about how, one, the gap between kind of the haves and the have-nots is widening and has really, I don't know, ever been wider than it is right now. But also, I mentioned earlier this year that, the facilities era of college football is over, and it's now into the NIL era of college football. That college football is undeniably, you can portion it up into eras. And when you're in the NIL era, does the NFL draft still have the same cachet with recruits that it used to? Obviously, 100%. They're still going to value the ability to be developed and put in to the NFL. Nobody's going to discount that. But that NFL draft stock and your ability to put players in the NFL draft used to be a really big thing for schools that aren't blue bloods and aren't necessarily on that cusp either, but are solid B tier teams in the sport. That maybe they didn't have the money to build a $100 million practice facility and spend millions on the locker room and things like that. Maybe they didn't have the best facilities or the biggest fan bases or the biggest stadiums, and they didn't play in front of 100,000 people every Saturday. But we're going to be able to put you in the league. Your second level teams, like for a while there, Michigan State was in that second level of the Big Ten and at times was the upper level of the Big Ten, or Iowa. Teams like that that could say, you're not going to come here and have a barber shop in the football practice facility, and you're not going to have some of the amenities that you might have at Oregon and USC and Texas and Alabama and Florida and Georgia and Ohio State and Michigan. But we're going to develop you and put you in the NFL. And that is, it was and is, and I think always will be, an important sales pitch. If you can tell kids, Iowa has produced like 15 tight ends that have been all world since 2000. And if you can tell kids like, hey, listen, we're not going to have new flashy uniforms. We're not maybe necessarily going to compete for national championships here. But if you want to come here, you get a good education, you have a good 4 years, you'll get some NIL money, and we're going to develop you and put you in the NFL. That's still a really strong pitch. But if we get to a spot where every coach that is stepping away from the game or is sharing their thoughts on the current status of the current landscape of college sports, all they do is bitch. The kids these days, all they want is money. They don't, like Nick Saban, it when he retired and was testifying to Congress. All he said, it used to be, kids would come for 4 or 5 years and they would buy in and we'd develop them and put them in the NFL. And now all they care about is how much am I going to play and how much am I going to get paid. So if that's really the case, and I don't believe that that's the case. I don't believe that that even 95% of players, all they care about is NIL money and playing time. I imagine that factors into the equation 100%. But if Georgia State started slinging money around, I can't imagine that they're going to get 5-star recruits. If they got their own Tillman Fertitta or T. Boone Pickens or insert super rich booster here from Georgia State who just said, screw it, I want to start schlepping money to kids in the Sun Belt. I don't think that they're just going to start picking up 5-star recruits because there are so many more things that factor into the equation other than NIL money and playing time. Now, those can be a priority. They can be a necessity. They can be really, really, really important to a player. But there are extenuating circumstances like championship pedigree, television exposure. For some kids, academic prestige still matters. And maybe most importantly, whether or not you can develop me and put me in the NFL. So I don't buy the idea that nobody cares about development anymore, et cetera, because generally you would think the kids who are able to look past being 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 and are able to look past the biggest and most lucrative NIL offers and are able to equate or able to figure out whether or not professional development and whether this team is going to put me in the league or not factors into their equation. The people who can look past that and do that are probably set up for a little bit more success than others anyway. But I just wonder if we get to a spot where when it is the undeniable NIL era, how much money I can get in NIL matters a lot to a lot of players. Do you lose sight of the fact that that's a short-term bag, that you can get more? Maybe if you take less money, go to a school that has a proven track record of developing players and getting them to the NFL. If you look at the top 10 teams that have had draft picks since 2000 or 2010 or whatever arbitrary date you want to decide from, there aren't many schools or names in there that are all that shocking. But there are some on the fringes of that top 10 where there is an Auburn or an Iowa or a Michigan State that makes you go like, oh, you know what? There is a path to the NFL that doesn't include going to Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, Texas, Ohio State, Georgia, LSU, Alabama. You can go to a second-tier school that's going to develop you to get to the NFL. And I buy into the idea that there are coaches that say, hey, we are having problems with people who don't want to put in the work or stick it out for a little bit for a better opportunity, that they're just going to chase the NIL bag and playing time. And I get that. But I don't think that's the player's job to necessarily recognize that immediately. I think it's the people around them, because there is a reason that you can't jump from high school football to the NFL. There needs to be a buffer. There needs to be some grow up time, some maturation, not only football wise, not only physically, but mentally, in business sense, in a spiritual sense. There's a whole lot of growing up that goes from being 18 years old to being 23 and in the NFL. And if coaches can sell that idea of, hey, I can put you in the NFL, all you have to do is come to my school and we're going to develop you, and we've got a track record of doing that, you don't necessarily hear about that as much. Now, maybe that's just not a public pitch. Maybe that's not a talking point in a press conference where trying to convince people who make like minimum wage in your fan base to donate to your NIL fund is an inherently public pitch. But you would think that, like, hey, instead of like, you're going to get Utah famously this past year, gave everybody a truck or a Jeep or whatever, basically whatever car they wanted for being on the Utah football roster. It doesn't take all that much to say like, hey, you can get a cool Jeep, which is nifty. That's great. Or you can make a second NFL contract if you come here and learn under this position coach or that coordinator or this head coach that has NFL experience, whether it's playing, whether it's coaching, whatever, if you can convince kids there is a path to the NFL for you here, for some of them, it's going to be just as important as I'm going to get you $180,000 in NIL money, because that's cheap. That's easy. It's the exact thing that coaches rail against, is the instant gratification. Nobody wants to work hard. You can't skip steps to greatness mentality that people don't have these days. They just want the quick gratification. Well, the quick and the easy business deal is like, hey, I'll give you $185,000. You come to my school. Great. Sign here. When it's a little more difficult to say, I need you to trust me. I can get you X amount of dollars, but I can get you 150 mil in the NFL if you're going to come here and learn how to play the game. So I think there's still a pathway to pitching, hey, there's an NFL pipeline for you here. And you just don't hear that much about it anymore. And I think that's maybe a lost art and a lost spot for teams, programs, coaches, colleges to highlight. I'm like, hey, Kentucky basketball did it for a really long time under John Calipari, where they would continually update, like, hey, players who came to Kentucky under John Calipari have made $2 billion in NBA salary. That is a powerful sales pitch, rather than so-and-so who's 12th on the bench last year made $68,000 for coming to Kentucky. Or you can come here, and if you go to the NBA, you can add to the $2 billion, billion with a B. That's a really impressive number, a really impressive figure. And when you're trying to get people to look down the line and see things down the line, and that's your strategy and your thought process on life, that's a lot easier to do than groveling for your fan base to, like, hey, could you give me $20 a month so we can get these kids some money? Get them their own money in the NFL. It's not that, I realize that there's more to it than that, but that should be the focus for a lot of these second tier schools, rather than being in the same spot that they were in the facilities arms race, where you're constantly like, God, I wish we could get a weight room like that program. I wish we could get hot tubs and cold tubs like that program. I wish we could get an indoor practice facility like them. Instead of being in that arms race, we put people in the NFL arms race. Doesn't that seem like a lot? Like, you can't do what everybody else, like, there's a reason the teams that are blue bloods and have been on top of the sport for decades and decades got there. And there's a reason, like, your school hasn't done that. So you got to find this alternate path to success. It can't be like, we're going to do everything the same way that everybody else does it, just in a worse spot. No, you can't be the Burger King of college football. Nobody wants to be the second best option, the imitator. You should want people to, instead of being the imitator, be the innovator. And I don't think there's enough of that, of we can't compete in facilities. Okay, now the priority for players has shifted. It's now all about NIL. And then the schools go like, shit, we can't really compete there either. Compete in developing players. And I realize that's a dangerous spot for coaches, because their thought process is, if I develop these kids, then they're going to get poached by a Power 4 school or someone bigger or better, or they're going to leave after 3 years instead of 4 years. And I don't get, at some point, it can't just be about like your job security, or you just got to do what's best for the players. And I know that somewhat can be this ridiculous thought for somebody, Dabo Sweeney. But at some point, you just got to do what's best for the players, and developing them and doing whatever you can to get them to the NFL, rather than dabble in this sandbox of, okay, we don't have enough money for facilities. Now we don't have enough money for NIL. We don't have enough money for coaching salaries. But just work on getting your kids to the league. And I think that's a pretty powerful sales pitch. Again, easier said than done, but I think it's a kind of a lost thought process, because you see everybody playing with the shiny new NIL toy over here, that getting kids to the NFL still matters like a lot. And they just don't treat it that way. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content that we're pumping out here on Saturday Glory. If you are listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you on Sunday. We'll probably look at the NFL draft from a different spot and also talk about another playoff. It's on the horizon. We'll see you then here on Saturday Glory.